This
lies in the
conference will now be recorded.
and now when we talk about the temperature control, there should be some input from the body, and that input is happens through peripheral nerves, that is warmth and cold receptors in the skin and in the organs, and the hypothalamus also can directly sense the warmth of the blood that flows through the region. Okay, now according to Harrison, the fever is defined as a normal temperature of 36.8 plus or minus zero point 0.4 degrees centigrade. Now, when we say 98.2 plus or minus zero point 0.7, why does this occur is that because the body has certain circadian rhythm. Typically, the morning temperature is lower than the evening temperature. That is when the body is more active. As the person completes his activities from morning to evening, body temperature increases slightly. That is 98.9 in the morning or 98, 99.9 in the evening. So what happens is that the morning temperature, if you are going to measure the patient's body temperature in the morning, anything above 98.9 is considered as fever, or in the evening at around 6 p.m., then you can say 99.9 degrees Fahrenheit would define a fever. So now, why this point degrees variation that is very important is because sometimes when you have to measure certain conditions where you want to measure, uh, for example, if you are going to measure body temperature in a woman who is menstruating, the temperature difference is usually lower than the lower during the 2 weeks before the ovulation, and then it raises to zero point 0.6 degree or 1 degree Fahrenheit with ovulation. This is important because sometimes you want to measure the temperature and use that as a marker to detect if the person is ovulating or if the woman is pregnant or not. So now more accurate tests have come, but previously this also used to be one of the tests to determine to confirm the pregnancy. Now, one of the things we have to differentiate uh, here is that we have to differentiate the difference between fever and hyperthermia. Both have increased temperature. The basic difference is that hyperthermia is nothing but uncontrolled increase in body temperature that exceeds the body's capacity to lose heat. Fever is not such condition. If the body wants to lose heat, the the okay. So what happens is that in fever, if the body wants to lose the heat, you can use antipyretics and decrease the set point of the hypothalamus, and then you can lose the heat. But in hypothermia, the set point is also not going to work, and the body loses the ability to lose the heat. That's why the antipyretics and all the medication, they do not work in hypothermia. And usually the set point in hypothermia is more than 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, is called hyperpyrexia. Now, this is important because usually if you are going to see a consultation of a patient with heat stroke, you do not give him paracetamol or any other drug which is going to control the temperature, that is hypothalamic set point, because that's not going to work. You have to use external applications such as cold blankets, etc. So this difference is very important from fever to hyperthermia. Now, once we have determined the difference between the both, first let's see what is the physiological mechanism from which fever is going to come. Okay, so we have to see the role of cytokines in the body. The initial infection, microbial toxins, or inflammation or inflammatory mediators, what they are going to do is that they are going to stimulate the monocytes and macrophages and all the other cells to release certain cytokines. These cytokines are like signaling molecules. There are several types of cytokines. For this fever purpose, the important cytokines are interleukin 1, 6, and TNF alpha, and interferon. Okay, interferon gamma. So why these cytokines are important, why are we learning in such detail is because if we can target these cytokines and all these steps, then we can control the fever at different levels. Okay, and once these pyogenic cytokines are released, they will act on hypothalamic endothelium, and they will cause release of prostaglandin E2 by activating uh, cyclic AMP, and they are going to elevate the thermoregulatory set point, and the body will try to conserve heat by heat production and decrease the sweating. Okay, this will lead to fever. This is how the normal fever is going to be presenting in the patient. Now, interestingly, there are 4 receptors for prostaglandin E2. Of these 4 receptors, only the third receptor is essential for the fever. And if you are going to take the cytokines and inject to the patient, there may not be fever for the patient, because cytokines produced in the brain are only going to account for the production of the fever. Okay, so this is the reason why when you are going to encounter a patient with CNS trauma or infection or any viral infections, they are going to produce certain cytokines in the brain which are going to directly stimulate the hypothalamus, and they are going to induce the production of fever. Now, I have put a star mark for pyogenic cytokines. This is because there are various checkpoints we can use the drugs to control the fever. Now, coming to the measurements, there are several methods you can use. One is oral temperature, rectal temperature, etc. The closest thing you can do in your OPD is, if you want to directly measure the core body temperature, you have to use rectal manometer. But in experimental conditions such as in labs and etc., if you want to scientifically approach, the closest thing that you can do to approach a core body temperature is esophageal temperature monitoring. Okay, that is the closest thing you can do. You can get to the core body temperature. So if you can measure it in the axilla or oral cavity, the temperature difference is not going to be more than 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit to 1 degree Fahrenheit. So in general practice, that's not going to make much of a difference. So we do not measure the core body temperature for all the patients. Now, one of the important things you have to keep in mind while measuring is that if you are going to measure axillary temperature at one point and you are going to measure same oral temperature in the evening, then you can see the difference of 1 degree in there. That is not going to mean the patient is going to have fever. You have to measure, you have to select a site and you have to measure it consistently to monitor a febrile patient. Now, there are certain people in whom the active infections now there are certain conditions in which active infections in absence of fever. Now there are certain conditions in which the patient may have infection, then can have trauma, but cytokines are produced, but the fever is not present. That is in newborns and elderly patients, chronic hepatic or renal failure, glucocorticoids, or anti-cytokine drugs. Now, what are these anti-cytokine drugs? We are going to discuss later. The newborns, this effect is decreased because the brain is not normally developed in these newborns, and in this hypothalamus and thermoregulator centers are not yet completely set in them. So similarly in elderly patients, because of constant chronic inflammatory activity, the hypothalamic centers may get numb and patient can have active infection without any fever. So even if a patient complains with joint pains and etc., you have to test for peripheral smear and you have to look for any site of infection if the patient is, let's say, above 60 years. And even in the patients with chronic hepatic or renal failure, the response of hypothalamus to the cytokines is blunted because of chronic inflammatory activity. So all these changes will lead to, if the patient is going to have any infection, the cytokine response and the fever production may not be present. So you have to be able to keep this in mind when you are going to go for a general practice, because the fever is not going to be presently complained in them. And if you are going to go for laboratory parameters and you want to determine what is the most sensitive measure of inflammation in the body. So now during the COVID time, we are going to see a lot of people doing interleukin 6, but that is only for to see if the patient is going to go for cytokine storm. That is not a measure of inflammation, because CRP is produced in the body. It is directly proportional to interleukin 6 levels. So you can directly measure CRP, which is much cheaper and it's going to be available everywhere. And ESR is also one of the measure of inflammation. If you're going to compare between CRP and ESR, that is erythrocyte segmentation rate and C-reactive protein. The C-reactive protein is like an acute marker, that is high sensitive CRP is going to be raised within 1 or 2 hours of inflammation. ESR may take 1 or 2 days. So if you're going to measure between both, CRP would be much more accurate. but it's a bit more costly than ESR. So usually in the routine clinical practice, that is usually in the OPD, we are going to do ESR for all the patients if you are going to suspect anything. Now, not only in the infective conditions, there are several autoinflammatory diseases in which fever is characteristic. There are certain conditions such as Beckett's disease or gouty arthritis, which you will not suspect the patient is going to have any fever because it's not related to any infective activity. But still, the patient can have fever. So you have to keep this in mind. These are the autoimmune conditions in which the fever is characteristically present. Now, once we have determined the causes of fever and pathophysiology, we have to know the types of fever. Okay, so there are several types of fever, but the most important of them are continuous, intermittent, relapsing, remittent, and Pearl Epstein fever. Please make sure that you get them, you read this part very carefully, because in undergraduate level, these are the usually questions which are going to be asked for you in your practicals or in your exam. Okay, so these are like small 2 marks questions, basics, which can be asked for you in your viva. Okay, now coming to the difference between these fevers. When you say continuous fever, it means that the temperature fluctuation is not more than 1 degree centigrade in 24 hours. That means there can be minor variations, circadian rhythm variations in the body, but that should not be more than 1 degree centigrade in 24 hours. And you can see the examples here. That is lobar pneumonia, typhoid, urinary tract infection, and brucellosis. Any end organ infection and everything can produce continuous sustained fever that is characteristic of bacterial. Okay, and next, intermittent fever. Okay, so what happens is that you can appreciate the difference between intermittent and relapsing fever. That is, the patient is going to have a decreased fever once the temperature is elevated. It reaches a peak, and it leads to and then it comes back to normal. Okay, so in relapsing fever, okay, sorry. In relapsing fever, what happens is that the temperature also is going to come back to normal, but there's going to be a pattern in this. Okay, intermittent fever, the cycling pattern is not, let's say, it's not going to be synchronous. Okay, in relapsing fever, typically you're going to see Plasmodium vivax or Plasmodium malaria. That is every 3rd day or every 4th day you are going to get the fever. Okay, and what do you mean by remittent fever? There is also fluctuation which is more than 1 degree centigrade in 24 hours. It is usually present in infective endocarditis, but the fever doesn't touch the baseline in the remittent fever. Okay, and typically there is one more fever called stepladder pattern of fever, which is present in typhoid. Okay, here also the temperature doesn't touch the baseline, but the temperature, if you're going to measure today and tomorrow and day after tomorrow, there's going to be a stepladder pattern of increase in the temperature. Okay, and one more special type of fever you have to know is the Pearl Epstein type of fever. This is usually associated with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it can be presenting as fever, high grade fever for 1 week, and about normal temperature for 2 to 3 weeks, and then you can have 3 more days of fever, and this cycle is going to be repeated again and again. This is very important because if you are going to see this pattern of fever and you are going to identify this Hodgkin's lymphoma, you can cause or you can prolong the life of the patient by early chemotherapy and interventions. As I told you before, here is the diagrammatic representation: sustained, intermittent, remittent, and relapsing fever. Okay, in remittent, you can see that the baseline is not touched, but there is a periodicity in that. Intermittent, the baseline is touched. And in the relapsing pattern of fever, the patient is going to have peaks of fever, and the baseline, there's going to be no fever for 2 to 3 days, and then there is going to be a cyclic pattern of fever there. Now, if you're going to see a patient with malaria, not every organism, or let's say not every species in malaria is going to cause typical third day fever, that is a tertiary fever. Only the species of Vivax and ovale is going to cause this type of pattern. And falciform or Nolensky is going to cause quaternion fever pattern, that is fever without any let's say circadian rhythm. This is because the falciform falciform organism is going to infect both young and old RBC, that is reticulocytes and matured RBC. So this is going to cause severe severe RBC destruction, and it's going to cause release of cytokines intermittently in the body without any pattern. So daily fever can be there. And there is one more pattern called quaternion pattern of fever, that is every fourth day. It is present in Plasmodium malaria. So this difference you have to know. So once you have established the patient, if the patient is going to come for you with fever, and you have established the patient is having the fever by measuring it, now you have to measure, you have to know the source of infection. So you have to look for these signs, that is sore throat. For example, if you're going to look for respiratory tract symptoms such as sore throat, nasal discharge, think of upper respiratory tract infection. If there is any associated headache, you have to think of any sinus infection, and you have to look for sinus pain. And if you're going to, if the patient comes to you with complaints of burning micturition, then you think of genitourinary symptoms. As you already know, the urinary tract infection is one of the most common cause of sepsis in diabetic patients. So as India is a leading country in, let's say it's going to be a diabetic capital of the world. So you have to keep in mind, you have to test for urinary tract infection in all the patients who are presenting with diabetes. Now coming to the abdominal symptoms, as you already know, diarrhea and weight loss, you have to check for any abdominal symptoms, that is any pain abdomen or any masses or any sinuses or any oozing of pus or anything. Okay. And one more important thing is that association with skin rash. This can be an association with skin rash. This can be a very high diagnostic clue in these patients. The thing is, there is a pattern of presentation for each and every disease, but that is not hard and fast rule. So this should only be taken as a diagnostic clue, but not a complete, let's say, specific and most sensitive or specific finding in the patient. Let's say if the patient is having vesicular rash, then you have to think of chickenpox, shingles, herpes simplex, etc. And if the patient is having centrifugal, then think of chickenpox in that patient. So the pattern of rash, and if the patient is having rash, inquire about whether there is a centrifugal presentation or centripetal presentation in the patient. Okay. And once you have inquired all that, you also have to take a detailed drug history also for the patient, because there are many drugs which can cause fever as a side effect. The Harrison mentions that potentially each and every medication, including PCM, can cause fever. So it's a bit controversial, but each and every medication has potential to cause fever is the line given in the Harrison. So now coming to the personal and social history in the patient. Now, if the patient is smoking, then you have to, if the patient is smoking and he has, let's say, about 10 to 15 years of history of smoking, then think of COPD or IHD or any other condition which can produce fever. So based on the history, you have to inquire about alcohol status also, because in case of liver cirrhosis and alcoholic hepatitis, the patient becomes susceptible to intra-abdominal infections. So all this history you have to take. And one more interesting thing is that in our country, in the villages especially, many people are being exposed to, let's say, dairy animals and etc. If such patients come to you with history of fever, you have to mainly think about the brucellosis and leptospirosis and all these infections, which are very rare in if the patient has no contact. This is because brucellosis requires special investigations to identify, which are not going to be present, which is not going to appear in your routine clinical examination or routine testing. So you have to, if the routine tests are normal, and if there is a history of contact with any dairy animal, etc., please think about brucellosis or leptospirosis also. And as you know, if the patient is having unprotected sex, sexual history, then test for HIV and on any STIs. Okay. Next, coming to one more important topic, that is pyrexia of unknown origin. Now, previously there were many definitions such as fever with intelligent investigations for about 1 week and etc. Now it has all been scrapped, and the definition of pyrexia of unknown origin now is the fever of more than 101 degrees Fahrenheit on at least 2 occasions, which is measured at the same site, and illness duration of more than 3 weeks, not 1 week, uh, which was previously present in the definition, and the person should not have any immunocompromised state. And diagnostic investigations were given, like a list of investigations were given, and if all these investigations are negative, then only we have to call the person as pyrexia of unknown origin. So what are those diagnostic investigations? So these are the obligatory investigations which we have to do in any patient before we are going to label him as pyrexia of unknown origin. So in this, you can see all these investigations. Just all this you will do routinely. The thing is that ferritin is one of the important things you have to remember, especially in this COVID time. This is being used as an inflammatory marker. If there is patient is having about more than 500 or 1000 ferritin, steroids are being given so that the cytokine storm and other complications of COVID-19 is not, the chances of cytokine storm is going to be low in these patients. So there are certain investigations which have certain, let's say, specific for one disease, such as protein electrophoresis for any multiple sclerosis, etc., and urine culture, chest X-ray, and all this you will do. Okay. And one more thing is that interferon release assay, which is used for diagnosing latent tuberculosis, has been added to the list recently. And as I told you before, including history, which we have asked previously. Apart from that, country of origin, recent travel history, or unusual environmental exposure, etc. And we also have to inquire about animal contacts, etc., as I told you previously. Now, routine physical examination, which is present in your case sheet, you are going to do for every pyrexia of unknown origin or any fever patient. But for pyrexia of unknown origin, these are the specific areas which you have to look for in the body, such as eyes. You have to look for fundal examination, and you have to look for any presence of lymph nodes, because usually, as I told you before, Hodgkin's lymphoma can present with Pearl-Epstein's fever, and you should not miss that. And apart from that, latent tuberculosis and all these presentations can have very low grade fever, and fever with sweating also can be present. Sometimes the patient will only describe the sweating without sweating and weight loss without fever. So lymph node examination is the very important. And I hope you know the size of the lymph node with correlation with area. That is, if cervical lymph node, if it is more than 0.5 centimeters, or axillary lymph node more than 1 centimeter, or inguinal lymph node more than 1.5 centimeters. These are all the significant, let's say, significant size for any investigations for required. Okay, so one more thing you have to look is that you have to look at temporal arteries, liver and spleen, whether there is any enlargement, because mostly tropical diseases which we are going to get in our country for any parasites will usually cause hepatomegaly or splenomegaly. We have to look for them. And temporal arteries, because there is giant cell vasculitis, there is a vasculitis which is called giant cell vasculitis or temporal arteritis, which can affect the presentation is going to be raised ESR. So what happens is that there can also be, if the patient recently had surgery, uh, there can be a pus oozing from the surgical site. So you have to look for any surgical site infection or any infected cannula site and etc. to see if there is any source of infection. So these are the special attention areas you have to see, and entire skin surface with mucosa, including mucosal membrane, should be examined, because you will read about them in Harrison, that is the viral hemorrhagic fevers and etc., which can present with a rash or a shark, and all these can be present in the private areas also, and so you have to look for all these findings in this patient. Now, some special points is that antibiotics and glucocorticoids, if the patient is already taking, let's say, usually the scenario which we are going to face in our clinical practice is that usually the patient is going to go for treatment outside, and he's going to use half of the antibiotics outside, and he's going to come for us with fever and etc., because the previous doctor has failed to control his fever. So in such situations, first stop the antibiotic and glucocorticoid treatment, which can mask the disease, and then you have to investigate, because according to Harrison, even a single dose of antibiotic, IV antibiotic, can decrease the blood load of the organism, and it's going to cause difficulty in identifying, culturing the organism and identifying the organism. So if there is any absence of all the specific investigations, you have to also do cryoglobulin levels. Sorry. Okay. So this is the flow chart given in the Harrison. Uh, we'll divide this into top part, that is obligatory investigations, and lower part. Basically, what the Harrison mentions is that once you have established the diagnosis of pyrexia of unknown origin with obligatory investigations, next thing you have to do is that you have to detect the source of inflammation. So what you're going to do for that is uh, fluorodeoxypositron emission tomography. So FDG PET, or fluorodeoxy glucose positron emission tomography. So what this does is that it detects the high rate of glycolysis, that is, it detects the metabolism in the body. So if suppose a patient is having, let's say, vasculitis, if you're going to do FDG PET in that patient, the vessels are going to appear as increased metabolic activity, that is, it's going to appear darker in this scan. So you can know the source of inflammation in this patient. Again, this is not going to detect any infection, this is only going to detect inflammation only. So only the anatomical location of a particular ongoing metabolic process can be seen. That is, a particular lymph node, if the metabolic activity is more, then it's going to point out to that. That is going to help in localizing the infection. So once you point out that, the further investigation is biopsy or any other further scan you want to do, you have to do in that particular site. So, and one more important thing is that it doesn't differentiate between inflammation caused due to infection or any other toxic metabolites in the body. So in this image, you can see the patient with pyrexia of unknown origin, and he has undergone a FDG PET scan, and you can see the vessels are in higher contrast compared to others. So the patient is having giant cell vasculitis. So ESR is increased, and the patient has undergone FDG PET. So we have identified the patient with vasculitis. So this is how the patient is going to be, the FDG PET is going to show you the localization of the source of infection. And one more important thing is that temporal arteritis. Why this temporal arteritis has been added to the list of diagnostic investigations which we have to rule out, because there are several rheumatological conditions which can produce temperature. Why only temporal arteritis is that they have found that in the intelligent investigations and all the let's say case scenarios and everything, they have found that about 17% of the elderly patients have temporal arteritis, which is being missed by this investigation list. So they have added temporal arteritis as a specific investigation which should be done. Look for temporal arteritis, and specific investigations have been added to look for this temporal arteritis. And though it can be diagnosed with DG PET, if you're not going to get any positive inflammatory site in that also, the Harrison mentions to go for temporal artery biopsy for every patient with more than 55 years with pyrexia of unknown origin. And it is present in the flowchart. This basic reason is that they have found higher incidence of this temporal arteritis in patients who have pyrexia of unknown origin. Now coming to the treatment, once you have done all the investigations and you have established diagnosis of pyrexia of unknown origin, now you want to treat the patient because the patient cannot keep having the fever. It's going to increase the morbidity in the patient. So what Harrison mentions is that don't go for antibiotics directly in the patient because that is going to be the clinical practice in the, usually we are going to see this in the RMP practice and everything, that is the antibiotics are going to be used indiscriminately in this country. So what Harrison mentions is that only if the patient is having hemodynamic instability or neutropenia, only then empirical antibiotic therapy should be used. Otherwise, you investigate the patient and use the specific antibiotic which is going to target the organism. And if the patient is having let's say weight loss and all those symptoms, but you're not going to get any tuberculin test positive, what it mentions is that do a tuberculin skin test or interferon gamma assay. And if that is positive, then do a therapeutic trial of anti-tubercular drugs for about 6 weeks. Okay. If after 6 weeks, you're going to, if suppose the patient is having enlarged lymph node and you're going to give anti-tubercular drugs for the patient, and you're going to see after 6 weeks, if the lymph node size has not decreased, or if tuberculin skin test or interferon gamma assay has not come negative, then it's probably not tuberculosis, and you have to think of any malignant etiology or any other uncommon conditions, and you have to stop anti-tubercular treatment. Now, one more interesting thing is that colchicine, which is being used in let's say genetic studies, it has been tried in patients with familial Mediterranean fever. This is a kind of let's say one of the most common diagnoses in patients with pyrexia of unknown origin. In other types of fever, it has not been found very effective. But if you are suspecting the patient is having familial Mediterranean fever, uh, let's say from high prevalence areas, then you can do a trial of colchicine in them. But you have to make sure the person is, if the patient is female, you have to make sure the patient is not a pregnant patient because it is highly teratogenic. And as I told you before, the flowchart regarding the fever pathophysiology. Now you can see the different drugs which are going to block the fever at different levels. If you are going to target pyogenic cytokines such as interleukin 1, then you have to use anakinra. And one more important thing is that NSAIDs and aspirin will block the synthesis of prostaglandin E2 by acting on cyclooxygenase enzyme. So this enzyme, what is going to do is it's going to produce the necessary steps required for PGE2 production. So it's going to stop there. And the most commonly used drug for this control of fever, paracetamol, is actually very poor cyclooxygenase inhibitor in the peripheral tissues. But once it enters the CNS, what happens is that it is metabolized to one more intermediate metabolite. This metabolite is actually a strong cyclooxygenase inhibitor, and it's going to inhibit this cyclooxygenase activity in the brain and hypothalamus. So it's going to decrease the thermoregulatory set point. Okay, and when you compare this NSAID and PCM, NSAID and aspirin are are very effective compared to PCM, but we are not going to use them because the dosage which is required for fever control in NSAID and aspirin is very high, and it can cause let's say increased side effects when compared to the same dose required for PCM. So the most commonly used drug PCM is not because it is more effective, but it's because it has less side effects compared to the other drugs. And now one more interesting thing is that glucocorticoids have been used to control fever for patients with pyrexia of unknown origin and in some cases malignancy also. So how does this act is cytokines level. These both levels it's going to cause interruption in this glucocorticoid. So but you have to make sure that when you are giving